Hey, I'm Tatu Laukkanen. I teach film at Tampere University and courses on Chinese cinema in the Finnish university system. This lecture is on the fifth and sixth generations of Chinese filmmakers. First, some background. After the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and Mao's death in 1976, China embarked on a policy of economic reform and liberalization under the guidance of de facto leader Deng Xiaoping. At this time, people experienced a relatively higher degree of freedom and liberty in the 1980s. This was reflected in cinema as culture in general, along with the economy. During this time, selective criticism toward former Communist Party policy was allowed to buttress ongoing reforms. Some films, such as veteran director Xie Yin's The Legend of Tianyan Mountain and Hibiscus Town, for example, were about the excesses of campaigns such as the Cultural Revolution. Part of the four modernizations started in 1978 was the overhaul of education to a less politically controlled direction. It is notable that this was the time of the cultural fever movement and other influxes of international culture, when students and intellectuals were enthusiastically dealing with ideas and influences from abroad following the loosening of state control. The Chinese fifth generation of filmmakers started film school and then working at this time, soon marking a departure from the state-sponsored socialist realism dominant in the films of the Mao era. So what is this generational categorization of mainland Chinese films? In the 20th century, as critics and teachers like to assert, Chinese filmmaking has been categorized to 6 chronological periods. These series of director generations are defined by their style and political economic context of the era they made their mark. The first generation are China's film pioneers from the silent era to the 1920s. The second generation was associated with the Shanghai studio system and also the concurrent time in the 1930s of the golden era of Chinese cinema and the post-war second golden era. The third generation is the generation associated with Mao era socialist realism. The fourth generation were the filmmakers sidelined during the Cultural Revolution that started making films after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976. The fifth generation we're dealing with in this lecture, or what some call Chinese New Cinema, as said, was trained in the early reform era and started working then in the 1980s. The sixth generation, known by many names such as the independent generation or urban generation, started working in the 1990s. Most of the prominent fifth generation filmmakers like Zhang Yimou, Chen Kaizhe, and Tian Zhuangzhuang were of the Beijing Film Academy class of 1982. Their class was the first to have gone through the school after the Cultural Revolution that had disrupted the functioning of the academy as it had done to education more generally. The Cultural Revolution also seriously disrupted film production, somewhat paralyzing the whole industry. After their graduation, the fifth generation directors were assigned to studios around the country, some of them to the provinces where they had more opportunities to work on their own projects and experiment. Zhang Yunzhao's 1 and 8, an innovative take on the war genre featuring outlaws fighting the Japanese, is considered the first film of the generation. The early works of the sixth generation, like Chen Kaizhe's landmark Yellow Earth and Tian Zhuangzhuang's The Horse Thief from the 1980s, were decidedly, or quite boldly, unconventional, and non-commercial. Even though they had residues and elements of socialist realism that was the acceptable mode of filmmaking in the Mao era, like soldier and peasant characters, these films shared a common rejection of the socialist realist tradition, for example, in the humanization and non-romanticization of the aforementioned characters and films, and also differences in film style. Here we need to remember that earlier socialist realist films, like in the Soviet Union where the style originated from, shared many attributes with classic Hollywood style. The early fifth generation films were less glossy accounts with more elliptical and ambivalent narratives and avant-garde visuals. So, the fifth generation directors were assigned to peripheral state studios such as Guangxi and Xi'an, or even applied to go to the provinces after hearing of their more allowing and opportunity offering work environment. Rural, even anthropological stories and settings away from political centers, often depicted with grand cinematography, such as the scenery of Yellow Earth, that replicated vistas of traditional Chinese landscape paintings, defined many of the works produced at these studios by these filmmakers. Key fifth-generation filmmakers made their early work at Xi'an Studios. For example, Zhang Yimou's directorial debut, Red Sorghum, was produced there. This was the era of economic liberalization, and studios were given more independence in terms of creative control both in artistic and economic matters. At Xi'an, commercial productions of the studio gave leeway to finance these more unorthodox films under the leadership of studio boss Wu Tianmin. During his tenure at Xi'an, Wu became a patron or godfather of the filmmakers that would soon be known as the fifth generation. Notably, the fifth generation filmmakers did not film life in their contemporary China. Censorship was still prominent, and most of their films were set in China prior to the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, in a less politically sensitive time. This general trend of dealing with the past is a noted distinction between their successors, the sixth generation filmmakers, who in the 1990s started focusing on present-day China. Zhang Yimou's Red Sorghum, for example, is set in the 1920s and 30s. It culminates in a fight against the Japanese. It initiated a string of colorful period films made by Zhang. Unlike the contemplative films made by Chiang Kai-shek, Zhang's melodramas, like Judo, made with Japanese funding and set in a rural China of the early 20th century, and Raise the Red Lantern, made with Hong Kong financing and set in the warlord era of the 1920s, were eroticized in terms of both visuals and content. Notably, all these films featured a glamorized presentation of the star Gong Li. Red Sorghum was a box office hit as well. That was not always a given with these unconventional art films. It should be remembered, though, that in the early 1980s, film exhibition as well as production was in a massive boom, with attendance and production records broken yearly. The popularity of cinema was high as the competing entertainment market was not as developed, even though it was making massive post-cultural revolution strides at this time. Beginning with Chen's Yellow Earth and even more so with Zhang's Red Sorghum that won the Golden Bear at Berlin in 1988, these filmmakers that were starting to be known as New Chinese Cinema got international attention at festivals and art house cinemas. International and critical success was then used by them to dribble past state controls with controversial content and to attract foreign funding. Even though competition from other entertainment increased during the Reform era, state funding for film studios and art films decreased. Then, this time saw studios shifting to products that audiences would be more willing to pay to see, putting emphasis on entertainment, emulating Hong Kong cinema and Hollywood. Some of the directors started to move to more commercially oriented affairs, such as Tian Zhuangzhuang with his 1988 Rock and Roll Kids about the emerging youth subcultures from the West. The fifth generation started changing their direction after the Tiananmen crackdown of 1989. This time, in general, marked not only the failure of the Chinese pro-democracy protest, but also the end of an almost decade-long era of intellectual openness that had correlated with this new cinema. So, getting financing from abroad was by now allowed by the state and encouraged. In the 1990s, directors like Chen, Tian, and Zhang made epic historical melodramas that more intentionally targeted international film festivals, art house audiences, and financiers. The 1990s brought them some of the most prestigious international awards. Chen Kai-shek won the Palme d'Or at Cannes for Farewell My Concubine in 1993, Zhang Yimou the main prize at Venice with To Live, and Tian Zhuangzhuang at Tokyo for The Blue Kite. Farewell My Concubine in its cast and production was emblematic of the transnational as well as pan-Chinese or greater Chinese direction the film industry had by now taken. It, for example, features Hong Kong superstar and cantopop singer Leslie Chang as a Beijing opera performer opposite Gong Li, who by now was an international star. It was based on a book by a Hong Konger, Lillian Lee. The producer was Taiwanese, so it was emblematic of a greater Chinese production. As the films dealt with history up to the reforms, they dealt with politically sensitive events such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. In accounting the hardships, for example, of the Cultural Revolution, these three films continued in the path of the scar dramas like Hibiscus Town that dealt with the traumas of this period. Because of this, all of them suffered from censorship as they portrayed a bitter past, but also sexuality and violence. This was post-1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown after all. Domestic criticism also accused the films of pandering to foreign tastes and self-orientalizing or self-exoticizing. After 2000, in the new millennium, if not before, the fifth generation directors participated in the increasing commercialization of cinema in earnest with lavish big budget films like Zhang Yimou's Hero. After making the visually spectacular and often star-featuring historical films of the 1990s with more, often international resources at their disposal, maybe it was natural that these directors turned from these epics to blockbusters or big films, dapian, like martial arts spectacles with high production values and stars such as Jet Li. Hero is an important initiator of the era of China's own blockbusters, and Zhang remains one of the most important commercial directors in the PRC. Chen Kai-shek's later works like The Promise, a wuxia spectacle like Hero, also rode the new commercial wave of the dapian. Many Zhang's later projects are patriotic blockbusters that can be seen as party propaganda and soft power attempts such as Flowers of War and The Great Wall, both starring Hollywood actors even though set in China. The main melody of propaganda runs even deeper in the recent works of Chen, such as My People, My Country, or the box office record-breaking Battle at Lake Changjin. Huang Yangxin, another noted fifth-generation director, embarked on the nationalist blockbuster road earlier with Zhuge Xuanlu or main melody films like Founding of a Republic. The Chinese sixth-generation filmmakers emerged in the 1990s after the fifth. but with a distinct departure in style, subject matter, and production methods. They were considered independent filmmakers working outside the state studio system, and they have also been called the independent and the urban generation, as well as underground, counter, and even dissident cinema. Another noted distinction between generations was that if the fifth often focused on historical narratives based on novels and lavish aesthetics, often set in the periphery, the sixth generation filmmakers turned their lens towards the often bitter realities of contemporary urban life in China, done with low production values and shoestring budgets. So these films weren't period pieces nor historical epics or grand narratives like the 1993 films of Chen, Tian, and Zhang. These films also, in postmodern fashion, also shine grand narratives in another way, notably in their bleak outlook of both socialism and capitalism, liberalism, these grand narratives. They portrayed a decaying Maoism at the same time as observing the downsides of China's step into market utopia. The sixth generation filmmakers experienced their youth during the reforms and opening up in the 1980s. That was a transitional period both in China, the cultural world, and in the Chinese film industry, as discussed. If the Cultural Revolution was the defining era of the fifth that came of age during that time, Deng's reform era was equally formative to the sixth generation. Many of the fifth generation filmmakers had, for example, been sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. Chiang Kai-shek was even a Red Guard who denounced his film director father. But the relatively liberal reform era, however, culminated in the June 4th or the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre that can be described as the sixth generation's one defining event that cast a shadow on their work. After the idealized student movement and its violent crackdown, the economic reforms were nevertheless continued, compounding disillusionment in an authoritarian capitalism and hope for political change. Political repression and apathy, as well as the increased commercial orientation of the industry, drove young filmmakers who wanted to express a personal vision and a critical take on society to go independent. The larger background of the sixth generation narratives, even though concentrating on individual accounts and characters, was a society in which the political, cultural, and economic spheres were in unsynchronization. Their films offered portrayals of social alienation, economic disparity, and cultural and physical dislocation reflecting the uncertainties of the post-socialist era. Along with the independent documentary filmmakers in China that had come active at the same time, the sixth generation was skillful in foregrounding the conflicts of the historical overlap between the socialist state form and the era of capitalist globalization through the stories of grassroots individuals. Independent documentary, that has also been called the New Documentary Movement, that started in the late 80s, early 90s, with filmmakers like Wu Wenguang and Wang Bing, sought to challenge conventional didactic, state-connected documentary practices and provide a more observant but critically pointed portrayal of contemporary Chinese society, more than official accounts. Independent documentary makers were connected to the sixth generation of Chinese filmmakers by personal links and friendships, formal aspects, and themes. Both low-budget filmmaker groupings engaged with social issues not covered in mainstream media in an observant, perhaps non-confrontational way, but still screening a social realism through subjective experiences of ordinary and marginalized people. Almost all of the sixth generation directors, in addition to incorporating documentary aesthetics into their fiction films, have also made several documentaries. Some like Ia Zhangke and Zhang Yuan more, others less. The sixth generation aesthetics and techniques also owe to and share with international art house film style, such as neorealism, that depicted the struggles of people in post-war Italy, and for example, neorealism's various global and Asian interlocutors, such as the Taiwan New Wave of the 1980s. Wang Xiaoshuai's Beijing Bicycle, about a rural migrant youth working as a bicycle courier, already in its title pays homage to the neorealist classic Bicycle Thieves. And I've heard that Bicycle Thieves is the most watched film at the Beijing Academy, at least during those generations we're dealing with. Also, the sixth generation, many of them went to the Academy, many of them in the class of 1989. But however, in this large grouping, like with the fifth generation, there were stylistic differences understandably in the sixth generation, but still major themes shone through. For example, regardless of its stylized film noir look, Lu Ye's Suzhou River's Shanghai is represented as a post-industrial shady world of urban illegality and immorality, instead of the booming socialist modern metropolis of mainstream renderings that is typical of the sixth generation's critical themes. Notably, the sixth generation's works, even though definitely not a part of mainstream pop culture, feature in them both greater Chinese and international popular culture that flooded the PRC in the 1980s. Pop music and mainstream and Hollywood films are cited in the narratives and soundtracks of the films. Also, a new sort of character emerged, one influenced by and emulating pop culture. Now I'd like to draw some connections with the aforementioned Taiwanese new cinema and the sixth generation, as it's a good way to show global and greater Chinese cinematic flows and bring out some aspects of the general style and form of sixth generation films. Taiwanese new cinema, of course, was a film movement that emerged on the island in the 1980s with illustrious directors like Ho Xiaoshen, Edward Young, later Tsai Ming Liang is a leading figure in the second new wave. But here are some qualities these two film movements share. They are often shot on location, so not shot at a studio, using natural lighting, that is not artificial lighting, utilizing long takes. The narratives are often fragmented and elliptic, akin to the early fifth generation. They use non-professional actors and use local dialects in speech. And their focus is on the social margins, like women, youth, the working classes, such as migrant workers and the poor. Both in general could be said to be a combination of this social realism, not socialist realism, but social realism and modernism about the accelerated modernization of Taiwan and the PRC. So, some connections between the fifth and sixth generations. They both share international festival success and the fascination and attention of art house audiences, critics, and academics, along with struggles with state regulation and censorship. The sixth generation filmmakers, even more so, had to deal with state control and censorship, more so than the still state studio and later market-oriented fifth. And they have faced significant challenges due to China's strict governance of film distribution and the censors. The sixth generation films were often inaccessible to domestic viewers, at least through official channels. Many of these works were unlicensed, banned, or heavily censored by authorities for their sensitive subject matter and critical portrayal of contemporary issues. and often the rife pirated DVD market and later digital downloading and watching of films, along with other unofficial systems, were their avenue of distribution. Zhangke's first three films, for example, Jiao Wu, Pickpocket, Platform, and Unknown Pleasures, his so-called Fenyang or hometown trilogy, were done without state sanctioning, and often people saw them via pirated DVD. His first overground film that was done with State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television permit was The World in 2004, which, like his celebrated still life, got official distribution. However, his later Touch of Sin, that features crime, violence, and audaciously questions the rule of law in China, suffered from a ban. And as said, all of the major sixth generation filmmakers have won accolades at film festivals, one of the biggest being Yia's Still Life's 2006 win at Venice that cemented his reputation as a leading sixth generation director. Critics have praised the sixth generation for their experimentation, uncompromising stance, and critical, if not subversive, takes on society and willingness to confront taboo topics, for example, of deviant sexuality. Zhang Yuan's 1997 East Palace, West Palace was the first Chinese film featuring homosexuality directly, for example. Another good example is Zhang Yuan's other film, this early landmark sixth generation film, Beijing Bastards, that dealt also with the margins, with the rock subculture in Beijing. Notably, the film's music is by Gu Yan, who also features in the film, and Do Wei and He Yang, who are some of China's rock and punk music pioneers. So, even though often observers like to draw strict demarcations between the fifth and sixth generations, they have features in common, and indeed the fifth generation's breakaways in the 1980s inspired the sixth. For example, Zhangke said that when he saw Yellow Earth at the cinema, he decided to become a filmmaker. And one thing in terms of themes these generations definitely do have in common is a fascination with popular culture as well as artists and performers, often at the mercy of forces beyond their control, sometimes even drawing connections between artists and prostitutes in their works. However, the Beijing opera performers, singers, and shadow puppeteer from To Live, for example, and other historical characters of the fifth generation have turned into contemporary subcultural and struggling artists in the sixth generation's works. These films about artists and intellectuals at the mercy of political and increasingly the works of the sixth generation market forces is not surprising considering the recent upheavals in PRC history and the filmmaker's own position in the cross pressures of international, state, and market demands and possibilities. And now we have come to the end of our lecture. Thank you.